Hey there. So, continuing with our theme of trying to make sense of the hell dialectical materialism is, I'm going to be reading from Polemics in Marxist Philosophy by George Novack. Particular, reading a essay, I guess you could call it, called In Defense of Angles. Our discussion this week at the Socialist Workers' Party's 1975 convention. If you don't know what the Socialist Workers' Party is, I think he's talking about the U.S. Socialist Workers' Party, which is a Trotskyist organization that a lot of other Trot parties split off from, have revolved around the new turn in the world situation brought on by the end of the post-war boom, and what this portends for the prospects of the class struggle in our work in the United States. The dialectics of capitalism's development, arising from its inaccurate contradictions, is becoming asserted with ever greater force. After 30 years of prosperity comes stagflation and large-scale unemployment. After the explosive and unchecked expansion of Washington's military might on the world arena comes the defeat of Southeast Asia. The socialist movement is now looking ahead and tooling up for corresponding shifts in the attitude of the American workers. They can be expected to change from raw material for capitalist exploitation into a more self-conscious and independently acting force for political and social change. This was 1975, but that's only really gotten more relevant, especially with the if you've been paying attention to unemployment recently. It's something else. I think it's maybe higher than it's ever been in the United States, at least since it's been being measured. These reversals at hand and in the making present a philosophical as well as a political challenge to us. The revolutionary vanguard requires a world outlook and a logical method capable of analyzing these unfolding processes and foreseeing their underlying trends. Fortunately, we have at our disposal the ideas of Marxism and the theoretical foundation of scientific socialism. I think that's a pretty good articulation of what dialectical materialism, or whatever you want to call it, scientific socialism, could be. I don't know if that's what it is in practice right now, though. However, Marxism itself is in a state of crisis nowadays in the international socialist movement. Several generations have been miseducated by the Stalinist degradation and distortion of Marxist theory that has been coupled with the political degeneration of the Soviet Union. The thoughts of philosophy of Mao Zedong have further addled the minds of many militants. Yeah, that might be true. Finally, just as the long detour of the world revolution through the colonial countries has induced rebels in the advance to embrace and extend this peculiar pattern and adapt to Castroism or Maoism, so in philosophy, many left intellectuals have been beguiled by the ideas held by the young Lukács, Karl Korsch, the Frankfurt School, including Herbert Marcuse, Max Horkheimer, and Theodor Adorno, Erich Fromm, Jean-Paul Sartre, and similar non-materialist interpreters of Marxism. I guess you could call some of those people non-materialist. These certainly many of them reject notions of scientific socialism. At least Jean-Paul Sartre does. I need to read more Lukács. Horkheimer and Adorno, I'm not sure if that's quite a fair characterization, though, from what I've read from them. These considerations make it advisable to assure that the philosophic orientation of our cadre is clear and correct as we contemplate the advent of more favorable conditions for the anti-capitalist action on a mass scale in the country. I will focus upon Friedrich Engels and his contribution to the elaboration of dialectical materialism. Um, this is, at least in part, some secondary literature on what we were reading last night, Anti-Düring and some of his other work on scientific socialism. This is my first reading of this, but I expect that he's going to cite Anti-Düring at the next page. Okay. I will focus upon Friedrich Engels and his contributions to the elaboration of dialectical materialism for the following reason. Oh, whoa. Sitting in front of a lake, an osprey just pulled something out of the water. That's neat. Tried to. Didn't look like it actually got anything. The fish was too big. The co-creator of scientific socialism has come under heavy fire in recent years on the ground that he switched Karl Marx's thought into the wrong track and distorted his teachings on philosophy. Just as Leon Trotsky is portrayed by the Stalinists as the antagonist of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin after 1917, so Engels is separated by his detractors from Marx. I have heard that take. I don't agree with it, but I don't know how prevalent it actually is. At least among Marxists. I've heard it more from anarchists. He's accused of deforming Marx's method in a mechanistic way, thereby being the progenitors of social democratic deviations and Stalinist dogmatism. This fabrication has been broadly accepted and embroidered by new left ideologies, ideologists in both East and West, because it undermines those elements of dialectical materialism. The critics want to discredit and discard. The variegated groupings applies salami tactics to the body of Marxist thought, although they do not slice it up the same way. The most unrestrained slicers cut Marx himself in half by discovering a contradiction between the young Marx and the mature Marx. Well, there's certainly developments in Marxist theory over time. You read Capital and Wage Labor and Capital, you'll find, originally he hadn't, came up with the concept of labor power, and that led to all sorts of problems in the theory. So there are contradictions. Engels' introductions to Wage Labor and Capital kind of addresses that, but there's a sense in which we should try to look at it as a coherent whole. He is supposed to have shifted his views in the wrong direction between the early humanistic writings and the publication of Capital. That's objectively the case if you just look at the theory he's outlining. It's really humanistic writings. I think what he's saying, though, is that his motivations changed, which I agree is not true. They unjustifiably introduced a sharp break in the normal process of growth, through which Marx deepened his understanding of many things from one decade to the next. However, most of the revisionists find Marx guiltless of misinterpreting himself, or let him off lightly as ambiguous. The other half of the team is singled out as the main culprit and bears the brunt of the attack. As the prime falsifier of Marx's real beliefs, the core of the indictment against Engels is that his version of dialectical materialism is essentially different from Marx's historical materialism. Well, this is something that I hear a lot, and I have a little bit of a problem with it. The idea that Engels came up with dialectical materialism. It's not true. Engels puts forward what he calls scientific socialism, which I think has some distinct differences from dialectical materialism. Um, at least as they, exist in bodies of work that use that name and as they are practiced. Um, the core of the indictment against Engels is that his version of dialectical materialism is essentially different from Marx's historical materialism. Yeah, no, I would say that they're using the terminology here. They rail against Stalinists, but they're using the names that Stalin gave to these to these theories. Seems like a bit of a misnomer. The true innovative humanistic Marx is to be found in such writings of the 1840s as the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 and the thesis on Feuerbach, which incidentally Engels recovered and published after Marx's death. So this is supposed to be about Karl Korsch. So I have to read these writers a little more extensively, but so far it kind of seems like a straw man to me. The true innovative humanistic Marx is to be found in such writings of the 1840s as the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, and the thesis of Feuerbach, which incidentally Engels recovered and published after Marx's death. This humanity-centered philosophy of praxis, according to the allegation, was disfigured and displaced by the deterministic, mechanistic, positivistic, and scientistic renderings of dialectical materialism Engels presented in his writings. Praxis, and the Greek word for human activity, popularized by contemporary philosophers. The false antithesis between Marx and Engels contradicts the basic facts about their relationship. Yeah, no, I agree. I disagree with this characterization of who he's supposedly debunking. But, yeah, if that really is their characterization, then then this criticism is valid. It is bluntly speaking a hoax, and serious socialists should beware of being taken in by it. And it's not like nobody says this. I have heard this concept from people that Engels is the first revisionist Marxist. But is that what Adorno was saying? Maybe. To read more Adorno. But negative dialectics is based on anti-Düring. Well, and Hegel, but when Engels first visited Marx in Paris in the summer of 1844, he later wrote, "We found that we were in complete accord in all theoretical domains. This was when our joint work began. It continued without let-up until Marx died in 1883. History has rarely witnessed so close, harmonious, and unabated an intellectual and political partnership. Their correspondences testifies to the communion of thought and lively interchanges of ideas on a multitude of subjects that found expression in their writings." Although Engels modestly assigned himself the role of second fiddle to Marx, the development of the dialectical methods and historical materialism was a collective creation. Engels and George Plekhanov later named the synthesis dialectical materialism. Okay, so I could be wrong about Engels not using the term dialectical materialism. I haven't found it in anti-Düring, but I haven't read Plekhanov, and I know that he is supposedly very important to the idea of dialectical materialism, so I need to read him. It was a collective creation. Engels and George Plekhanov later named the synthesis dialectical materialism. Marx and Engels elaborated its fundamental principles together in the 1840s. Most of what they wrote thereafter, whether in the form of newspaper articles, manifestos, pamphlets, or books, was either discussed beforehand or submitted to each other's surging critical scrutiny. So yeah, that's an important point, and is absolutely true. The idea that you can separate their ideas when they were revising and editing each other's work, and they practiced theoretical unity in a way that we can all learn from. So that's an important point, even if I'm a little skeptical of his characterization of people who make this claim, apparently. Whatever differences of opinions they had on this or that minor matter, there is no record of disagreement on any important theoretical or political question during their 40 years collaboration. Althusser would be, I think, an interesting person to talk about through this lens, because he kind of almost takes it the other way, to separate materialism from dialectics. I think either way is bunk, but whatever differences of opinions they had on this or that minor matter, there is no record of disagreement on any important theoretical or political question during their 40-year collaboration. Engels was so familiar with Marx's criticism of political economy that he alone could be entrusted with piecing together and putting into publishable shape the second and third volumes of Capital. Anti-Düring by Engels was the fullest exposition of Marxist philosophy, issued while Marx was alive. It was a preliminary sketch for dialectics of nature and shares the same theoretical viewpoint. Anti-Düring was undertaken by Marx's insistence. He endorsed every word in the book, which Engels read to him before sending it to the printers. Therefore, any dissent from the ideas presented in its pages is ipso facto a disagreement with Marx, as much as Engels. Sure. Yeah, I guess. What's he doing here, though? It seems to be just, doubling down on this framing. Things are true because Marx said them. Engels is just as valuable as Marx's theoretical contributions. Why shouldn't it be called Engelism? He's a better writer, at least stylistically. I guess because he wasn't a prole, it wouldn't be as good of a look. The latter made this clear when he wrote in the preface to its second edition. I must note in passing that inasmuch as the mode of outlook expounded in the book was founded and developed in far greater measure by Marx and only in an insignificant degree by myself, it was self-understood between us that the exposition of mine should not be issued without his knowledge. Engels likewise noted in the preface of the first edition of The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State that he had drawn extensively upon Marx's prolific observations and conclusions in writing the book. Long after their death, the myth-makers are attempting to do what was impossible during their lifetime: pit the one revolutionist against the other. This gambit is not new. In a letter to Edward Bernstein, written April 23, 1883, shortly after Marx's death, Engels said, "The fable about the nasty Engels, who had led the benign Marxists astray, has been repeated many times since 1844." A letter to Edward Bernstein, written by who? That's interesting. I'd like to read that. Yeah, I do hear this characterization of Engels being the Stalin to Engels being being the Stalin to Engels being to Stalin as Lenin is to Marx. And it's bullshit. But I don't see it in writing a lot. Writing on image boards, not in books, because it's obviously a very silly argument to make. But I haven't, read extensively from the Western Marxists or Frankfurt School, so maybe that will be part of this study on dialectical materialism. George Plekhanov and Karl Kautsky are said to have extended the derelictions of Engels in the next generation. To spice the dish, it is implied, if not always stated, that Plekhanov had bad conduct in 1905, 1914, and 1917. And Kautsky's betrayals from 1814 on are traceable, at least in part, to the philosophic deviations derived from their mentor. When you look at the problems with Kautsky, and it's this kind of like fixation on electoralism, which, if we want to hold up the Bolsheviks as like the best example of Marxism being actualized, which I think is exactly what we should do. Even early Stalin, or Stalin as a person. He did some bad stuff, but he was certainly an effective revolutionary. Then we should criticize Marx a little bit. Because what did the Bolsheviks do to a degree? They revived some of like the tactics of the anarchist faction of the First International. Lenin was influenced by Nechayev, this idea of the professional revolutionary. They were willing to be conspiratorial in a way that Marx did not like, and I think that was part of their success. So I'd be hesitant to hold up Kautsky. I think he kind of represents the worst tendencies that we can see in Marx, magnified. To spice the dish, it has implied, if not always stated, that Plekhanov had bad conduct in 1905, 1914, 1917, and Kautsky's betrayals from 1914 on are traceable, at least in part, to the philosophic deviations derived from their mentor. To top off this indictment, just as George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel has been held responsible to some extent for the Kaiser's Prussianism and Hitler's totalitarianism, so Engels is alleged to have fed the version of Diamat disseminated by the Stalinist school because his dialectical materialism subordinated the human individuals to the laws of nature and history. Dialectical materialism, as it exists, disseminated by Stalinists, is a good example of like a metaphysical outlook as railed against by Engels. So the idea that that's a continuation of Engels is wrong, but he's setting up a false dichotomy here. To round out the rogues gallery, Lenin is charged with carrying forward this vulgar materialistic mode of thought in materialism and empirio-criticism, although he began coming to his senses in the philosophical notebooks. We are to credit this caricature of the development of Marxist philosophy. All the leading exponents of European socialists, through from Engels to Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, and Trotsky, misunderstood Marx's ideas and went astray. Well, Trotsky definitely did. I don't know about Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, and Engels, but you just read the ABCs of materialist dialectics, you're not going to find anything in Engels that says A does not equal A. This melange of misrepresentations has been taken up by the academic Marxologists who willingly retail about such misinformation to untutored pupils and unwary readers. Here is how the British philosopher Anthony Quinton formulates the tale in a review of recent books on Hegel in the May 29, 1975, New York Review of Books. The official Marx of the interwar years, discredited by the theological ornamentation of Stalin's slave state, was the late scientistic Marx of Das Kapital. As interviewed by the naively positivist Engels, whose task it was to generalize Marx's theory of history and society into the comprehensive philosophy of dialectical materialism. Engels explicitly states in Anti-Düring that the point of dialectical materialism is not to create some like overarching philosophy, but to render that kind of pursuit obsolete. by particular sciences of everything. So no, it's not to generalize Marx's theory of history and society into a comprehensive philosophy of dialectical materialism. It's to insert that it's such a philosophy is unnecessary. Let's see. It's getting dark. Let's do a couple more paragraphs and then I'll pause it and we'll start this back up inside. Quentin naturally prefers the libertarian image of Marx dreamed up by the petty bourgeois humanists, who he says emphasize man as the creator of himself and the world. Unlike this newfangled Marx, the original Marx, oh, so that's a quote, Anthony Quinton. Yeah, so that's the problem with Quinton. So what I just stated. So that's not a criticism of Novack here, but I'm not sure if he's going to point that out because he is defending dialectical materialism here. And that would be the best argument, as I see it. But he's going on to just reassert that Marx and Engels agreed about everything, which is mostly true. It depends on whether you want to buy into the conspiracy theory that Stirner is actually Engels, which, I used to be very skeptical of, but as I read more Engels, and I notice that he at times is holding back, because obviously on face value right here, let's the rest of this about the conspiracy theory about Stirner. So the idea that Stirner is really Engels. I thought it was a little crazy at first. It sounds pretty good because there's some pretty fishy stuff, especially with the years that the German ideology and Stirner's critics were published. Stirner's critics were published, or was published before the German ideology, which is pretty weird considering that it is a response to the German ideology. There's also the fact that Stirner even then was kind of irrelevant, and Marx spent so much of the German ideology criticizing him. And then there's also the fact that we have no pictures or really any material evidence that Stirner ever existed, except for some drawings that Engels did of Stirner at the Young Hegelians meeting that Engels and Stirner met, but Marx and Stirner never met. Yet they had this ongoing feud. And also, if you look at those drawings, right? Engels didn't draw himself in those drawings, but he did draw this kind of badass looking guy, with a if you were gonna do a doodle, everyone else in the drawing just looks ridiculous and ugly, and then there's Stirner looking absurdly elegant. So that was Engels' way of drawing himself into the picture. It kind of all makes sense that way. But my original way of debunking that was just that Stirner is a better prose stylist than Engels. Certainly a better prose stylist than Marx. But as I read more Engels, it kind of seems like he's holding back in some places and kind of trying to write a little more like Marx. As Marx kind of writes in this Hegelian sort of Hegelian kind of prose that is rather obtuse. And then you read Stirner's writing, and it's just beautiful, poetic, flows very nicely. And Engels kind of a lot of the time seems to be emulating Marx, but I catch little hints in some of Engels' works that he, did actually have the capacity to write clearly. So the idea that Stirner's writing was actually maybe what Engels, privately thought, but never would divulge to Marx, or it was merely just a concoction that they made up to, debunk certain ideas, right? Kind of a, a straw man that they wanted to make up with young Hegelians. That could also be it. But yeah, let's cut that off for now. That, will I finish it? Maybe not. Not on video. We'll do like a part 2 or something. But I think I'll call this good. It's half an hour, and do Khanov next time. Maybe Stalin. We'll see.